that testimony, Janice.
Hi, my name is Janice Kephart, and I am the border counsel responsible for investigating the 9/11 hijackers' terrorist travel plans into the United States. During the course of my work for the 9/11 Commission, I reviewed hundreds of documents and interviewed every single officer who let in a 9/11 hijacker at a port of entry, as well as consular officers who issued visas and senior officials in the United States government responsible for immigration policy. To set the scene of how the 9/11 hijackers got in and stayed in the United States long enough to execute 9/11, it is essential to understand that prior to 9/11, the U.S. government did not associate border security with national security or counterterrorism. I knew this firsthand from my congressional oversight responsibilities over the Justice Department in the late 1990s, where the Immigration and Naturalization Service was housed. The marrying up of border security with national security was, in fact, the result of our work on the 9/11 Commission investigation as to how the hijackers got in and stayed in the United States long enough to execute the horrific events of 9/11. I pen the phrase terrorist travel to describe the strategic operational movement across borders for the purposes of executing terrorist activities. And that is the term we use today to describe how terrorists move around the world. The entry of the 9/11 hijackers into the United States represented the culmination of years of practice and experience in penetrating international borders. Al-Qaeda had expert document forgers and traffickers on staff. Terrorist travel was a real thing for Al-Qaeda long before we figured it out as 9/11 Commission staff. In short, to help support the 9/11 operation, there were 26 Al-Qaeda terrorist conspirators who applied for United States visas to enter the United States for the purpose of committing 9/11. 20 were successful in acquiring visas, while 5 others were Yemeni nationals who were denied visas solely based on economic reasons. None of the reasons for the denials had anything to do with terrorism. 19 of the hijackers out of 20 who obtained U.S. visas were able to make it through border security at U.S. ports of entry. Only one was rejected in Orlando in August of 2001, and that is why there were only 4 hijackers on United Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, instead of 5. So I'm going to move on from here and talk about border vulnerabilities that we uncovered in our 9/11 investigation. The first was easy access to U.S. visas. So let me review who obtained visas easily and successfully. All 15 who obtained visas successfully were the muscle hijackers and 1 pilot who was also a Saudi. Of the other pilots, Jera, United 93 Pennsylvania pilot, was Lebanese. Atta was Egyptian, Shehi Emirati. All 3 of these men were living in Germany at the time and did not present as economic immigrants. They were all doing fine, and they represented as residents of Germany. Thus, they had an easier time applying. The Saudi pilot who applied as a student to a school he had already attended in the United States. That was the 1 pilot and the 1 hijacker who applied as a student and not as a tourist to get into the United States. The 15 muscle hijackers from Saudi Arabia had their visas submitted by travel agencies, and none of them were interviewed. Each of those visa applications were full of deficiencies. Those applying for tourist visas were not interviewed either, again because Saudi Arabia was a country that spent a lot of tourist dollars in the United States, and they didn't receive a lot of scrutiny as a result. The 13 Saudis who presented new passports these passports were less than 2 weeks old, and they presented these to the U.S. consulates to get their visas. And then were immediately, upon being issued the U.S. visas, we know at least 6 of them were flown into Iran without their passports being stamped to be trained by Hezbollah deep in Iran underground on a Chinese-acquired Boeing lookalike to the planes that were actually hijacked on 9/11. Hezbollah at the time was a fully financed sponsor terrorist organization at Iran's behest. Now, we do not cover the Iranian connection in any depth in the 9/11 Commission report. This has been reported numerous times. The reason for that was our commission was given a statutory expiration date of 14 months. The information linking Iran to the 9/11 plot was not uncovered until 2 weeks prior to the expiration of our commission and the release of the final report. Thus, there's reference to Iran, but no in-depth knowledge because we were not able to investigate. I, on the other hand, was able to be part of an investigation years later that did lead to explicit information of material support of Iran for the 9/11 operation. We know they helped train them and hide their travel. Now, back to the hijackers. What did we know from their visa applications? Not only did they have new passports, we know at least the visa applications themselves were lied on in detectable ways by at least a few of the hijackers. 2 Saudis who had studied at U.S. flight schools in the late 1990s in the United States. These are the famous Hazmi and Midhar, who the FBI was not told about until right before 9/11, when they were known about by the CIA a year prior. It has been a continuing controversy ever since. The 2 Saudis who had studied in the United States, Hazmi and Midhar, they had studied at a flight school. They hadn't done well, but they had easy access and they understood the United States. So they weren't picked as pilots, but they were picked as part of the operation. And then you had your 9/11 operational mastermind, colleague Sheikh Mohammed, who had studied in North Carolina in his youth. And he was easily able to obtain a visa also through a travel agency. And it was through a fraudulent name, but he never came to the United States. And that is probably because he knew full well he was well known by American authorities, and he didn't want to tip the hat of the 9/11 operation that he was helping to organize. All in all, the 19 hijackers used 364 aliases, including different spellings of their names. But these aliases made it very difficult for the intelligence and law enforcement community to trace who the hijackers actually were, and gave rise to our eventual recommendation in the 9/11 final report to include biometrics in immigration and border security vetting from and going forward, and really help change the way borders are done today across the world. 3 hijackers carried what we learned later was a calling card in their passports. We believe that this quote-unquote passport was to help them be acknowledged by other al-Qaeda members as they moved across borders, and specifically by Iran itself. At least 2 hijackers we know had fraudulently manipulated passports to hide travel to Afghan training camps and make it look like they had been traveling in Western countries instead. Now, to be clear, because the hijackers carried their passports on the planes with them on the morning of 9/11, you would expect actually that we would have none of their passports that were recovered. In fact, we had 6 passports recovered, 2 from the World Trade Center sites of documents that floated down to the ground and passersby picked up and provided to the FBI, and 4 others that were in the tail of the plane of United 93 that crashed in Shanksville. And because that plane tail was in the air when it was crashed by the hijacker, there were some remnants of survival of some documents from the back of that plane. So that brings us to, we've got an idea of the visas and the manipulated passports and the manipulated visa applications. So let's move to the hijackers actually walking through U.S. airport ports of entry through our border security there at the time. So all in all, let's start with the pilots. The 4 pilots passed through immigrations and customs inspections 17 times. 4 pilots, 17 times from May 2000 to August 5th, 2001. The 2 World Trade Center pilots, the leader of the operation, Mohammed Atta, and his best friend from the German Hamburg cell, Marwan al-Shehi, each entered the United States 3 times each. And I will talk later about the fact that Atta should never have been let in on his last time in. The Pentagon pilot, who had trained in Arizona prior to 9/11, his name was Hani Hanjour, had entered on an academic visa, and he had previously gotten that pilot's license I mentioned in Arizona. And the United 93 pilot, Jarrah, had entered the United States 7 times in and out, each time successfully. 5 times these pilots were pulled into a secondary inspection at the borders. What that means is, if you've gone through U.S. borders, you know that there's a primary inspection where an officer greets you, you open up your passport. They might take, if you're a foreign national, they'll take biometrics. At the time, they weren't doing that, but today they do that. And they basically will ask you a couple questions and welcome you to the United States. If there are any red flags, if, for example, a red light comes on that indicates that you are on some kind of watch list, or there's some other indicator that the officer notes from his experience, he will refer you to secondary inspection. There you're interviewed. It may take some time. It can take, hours. If it's a serious issue, it can take days to determine your status as to whether you will be let into the country or you will be flown back by the air carrier to whence you came from. So 5 times. The pilot hijackers were pulled into secondary inspection at the borders, and 4 times, 5 times were a combination of muscle and pilot, and then 4 times were the pilots. The only time anybody was not let in was the single muscle hijacker that came in by himself in August of 2001 to help fill the last spot. So it would be 20 hijackers instead of the 19 hijackers. But the 4 pilots, each time they were pulled into secondary inspection, made it through their interviews and secondary inspection and were allowed into the country. So all in all, the hijackers were successfully entered into the country 33 of 34 times over 21 months through 9 airports, all entering the East Coast, but for 1. All but entered as a tourist, as I mentioned before. And why they wanted to enter as tourists is the visas enabled long 6-month stays, and they were the easiest to obtain and the least scrutinized at the border. So they were kind of the perfect match for coming in. So you had your muscle hijackers coming in about 5 months before 9/11, and they would come in 2s and 3s. The only one that was rejected was the one that came in by himself in August of 2001. And I believe, having studied the patterns of these hijackers and how they moved, that the Al-Qaeda was concerned that the muscle hijackers, all being from Saudi Arabia, none of them really speaking English, all being very young, needed to have a colleague with them in case something went awry, and to help each other make it through and to keep track of each other. The pilots, having been well educated, either having lived in the United States or in Hamburg, Germany, were considered to be less of a risk and were much more trusted and were able to travel in and out of the United States on their own with self-confidence that they could make it through. So in terms of sort of statistics, 5 hijackers were referred to secondary. 3 hijackers filed applications for change of status. What that is your immigration application for change of status inside the United States. So you come in as a tourist, you want to change to a student visa because you want to learn how to fly a plane in the United States. They apply for change of status applications to extend their stay. And that's what the pilots did, because they came in much earlier. They came in a year earlier, and they came in as tourists. They came in July of 2000, and they came in as tourists, but they needed to extend their stay so they could make it till September 2001. So they applied to change status to that of student. There was something else that happened while they were here that was really interesting. They all realized that to get through airport security on the morning of 9/11, they need to look as American as possible. So the 19 hijackers sought to get U.S. identifications. That made them look more like assimilated American residents than foreign nationals. So one interesting aspect was that 6 Virginia residency cards were used to pass through airport security on the morning of 9/11. Those 6 Virginia residency cards were obtained from 2 immigrants that were solicited at a 7-Eleven in Falls Church, Virginia, and they recycled those residency cards 3 times to get the 6 IDs for the hijackers that were used basically at Dulles, Washington Airport on the morning of 9/11. Those were where those 6 Virginia residency cards came in handy. Of course, all of them were not used because of the numbers that we had on the flights that morning. But all in all, the 19 hijackers had 36 U.S. IDs, and the IDs, these are legit IDs, were obtained from Florida, Maryland, and California, and Virginia. So it was a pretty interesting add-on to our investigation, learning about the abuse of the DMVs in those states by the hijackers. Only one muscle hijacker. So here was another interesting aspect. Only one muscle hijacker didn't have a U.S. issued ID. And I surmised from my research that was probably because he knew he was out of immigration status. He was one of the hijackers who was out of immigration status because the immigration inspector that let that hijacker in let him in as a business entry, and that only gave him a few days. Entry in the United States. If you come in on a business visa, you can only be here for the time of your business, then you have to leave. So he didn't have the 6 months. And I think they believed that the immigration system was connected to the ID systems in the States, which at the time it was not. And so he was afraid to go get a residency card. And ironically, he was one of the individuals that was scrutinized much further because he did not have an ID card on the morning of 9/11. Now, we know that although airline personnel found strange behavior, especially at Dulles, with the hijackers there, they all were able to get through security anyway. So let's talk a little bit about the ringleader, Muhammad Atta, because from my investigation, the events of 9/11 would not have happened without Atta. He was the operational leader. He was the reason that they all kept in line and did what needed to be done on the morning of 9/11. And he was the one person that absolutely should not have been let back into the country. Of all the secondary inspections, immigration law is very gray and fuzzy. His was, in my opinion, and in the opinion of some immigration counsels that I had helping me with this, the person that should not have been able to come back into the country. So I want to just go through and explain a little bit about Muhammad Atta and how he was able to get in and stay in the country so easily. So on the morning of 9/11, Atta was the first pilot to crash Flight 11 into the North World Trade Center. He led on the ground. He led in the sky. What I learned about Atta, and some of this is well known, and you may know, and some of this you may not know, but I'm just going to go through it quickly. Atta was an Egyptian who had graduated from Cairo University with an architectural degree about 1993. He actually had made friends with a German family, and they encouraged him to come to Germany to continue his studies. And with their help, he went to Germany. Atta was considered smart, and he even graduated with another degree. He was very pleasant, but Atta did not like Christians, and he became increasingly abrasive and began to stand out as a decision maker amongst colleagues who was charismatic but did not tolerate dissent. He was very anti-American and anti-Semitic. He began to advocate violent jihad. He built a cell, and before long, he starts traveling to Afghanistan. 6 years later, by 1998, he was considered a changed man by his friends back in Egypt. But his intelligence and leadership qualities made him a great fit for leading a suicide mission. Atta's leadership was really, really important because 3 of the 4 9/11 pilots came from that Atta cell in Hamburg, Germany. So Atta becomes involved with Al-Qaeda. He goes to the Afghan training camps. Clearly, at some point, he is chosen to lead this operation, this planes operation into the United States, and also lead the group of men logistically as well during their time in the United States. So he goes and applies for a visa at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. The consular officer who was adjudicating his visa said that he was definitely not interviewed. And we did interview the consular officers who adjudicated these visas, even if they were not individually interviewing these people, the hijackers, in person. But they did tell us a lot about the process, and we did interview all the consular officers. So what they told us was this, the consular officers from the State Department. First, Germany is a visa waiver country, and in reciprocity, the U.S. does not require visas for tourists from Germany or 20 other countries. That's still the case today, and it's something we do to help exchange travel and economics of scale to us, between ourselves and our allies. Atta had been in Germany for 5 years. So for a tourist visa, Atta was treated like a German citizen. He basically had German residency. Also, he was an educated student. So that was important to U.S. policy because the U.S. does not want to be supporting immigrants if at all possible. You are supposed to be able to come to the country and financially support yourself. Because he had 2 degrees, it was considered that he would be able to do so. He did not appear as an economic immigrant. So he passed that test. He certainly did not fit the profile of a terrorist that we had in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world sort of designed a profile of up till the time of 9/11. And we were told by the State Department that if Atta had applied for a student visa, he would definitely have received a lot more scrutiny, but because he had 2 degrees, he would have been granted a student visa anyway. So he gets his visa. The other pilots in the Hamburg cell get their visas too, but we're just going to continue to focus on Atta here. Okay, so upon his entry into the United States, his first entry was with his best friend at his side, Marwan al-Shayhi, who also was the pilot of the plane that went into the South World Trade Center tower. On July 3rd, he and al-Shayhi entered together. They enroll immediately in Huffman Aviation in Florida. Now, they're on tourist visas. They're not on student visas. So they quickly realize that they need to switch their status over to student. Plus, that student visa will give them the extended stay they need to be able to stay in the United States until when they thought their operation was, which was clearly they had an idea of when that was going to be, and it was going to be greater than 6 months from July 2000. So they apply to change their immigration status from tourist to student. In those days, you cannot do it now, but in those days, you could apply while in the States to change your status. Their Huffman aviation training goes pretty darn poorly. Their English is bad, and they're struggling. They're not passing their exams. They move over to another Florida aviation school called Jones. At Jones, the instructor reports that Atta is very aggressive. Even before he's passed any tests, just in the air, he tries to force the controls more than once. And the receptionist reported to us on the commission that she felt personally threatened. She was personally threatened by Atta more than once. And even at Jones, they both fail. Both Shehi and Atta fail their aviation tests initially. But they keep at it, and later in November 2000, they both pass their tests, and they start signing out planes and logging hours in the sky. Meanwhile, Atta passes his aviation test in November 2000. He's already applied for a change of status, but he hasn't been granted it yet, and his tourist visa expires in December 2000. So the rule is, if you have applied for a change of status, you are not to leave the country, the United States, until that change of status is fully adjudicated and you have an answer as to whether it's granted or not. That, of course, had not happened a month later in December 2000, and Atta leaves anyway. He leaves the country. We think that this was a pretty important trip where he syncs back up with logistic leadership of Al-Qaeda as to what the operation is to entail. We believe he picks up money, etc. And he returns in January 2001 to the United States. He attempts re-entry. The primary border inspector notes that his tourist visa is expired and sends him to secretary. This is supposed to stop cold his entry in the United States. Immigration law is extremely clear that if your tourist visa is expired, you are not supposed to be allowed into the United States. And as I mentioned before, immigration law is also clear that if you have applied for a change of your immigration status, you are not to leave the United States until that decision is made or you have received permission to leave the United States. Atta had not received permission. So under two different immigration law statutory requirements, he should not have been allowed into the United States. However, that's not what happens. This was the one immigration officer I interviewed who clearly remembered Atta, but this immigration officer refused to cooperate with us on the 9/11 Commission. There was not one other government official, whether they were an officer at the port of entry, whether they were a consular officer, whether they were a high-level executive, who refused to cooperate. But this particular immigration officer decided that he was going to blame the fact that there was no student tracking system in place, which there was not at that time, and that he simply believed Atta's story that, he'd made a mistake, he didn't realize that his tourist visa had expired, he didn't realize that he wasn't an official student in the United States, and the immigration officer said because nothing was clear in the system about his student status, he just decided to let him into the country anyway. So that is the story of Atta coming in January 2001. It was the most pivotal immigration entry for the 9/11 plot. And we will never know if 9/11 would have occurred if Atta had not been allowed back in the country in January of 2001. So that is a story of a pretty important terrorist travel operation into the United States. And I hope you enjoyed it.